some would say abrupt change, only a few months after the policy to have a second child, now already thinking about giving incentives to have a second child. Mr. Yan, Mr. Li.
Thank you, Tianwei. This is a very, very pertinent question in the current Chinese context. Now, China's family planning program was going on, for a long time, like nearly 40 years, and like everything else, the Chinese really made a huge effort and quite, which turned out to be quite successful with the family planning program, and the fertility was really brought down so drastically. Mm-hmm. And now overnight, the Chinese have found themselves that they're short of labor and the fertility is too low. Right now it's 1.6. That's well below the replacement level, which is 2.1 usually. So it's I'm glad the government is waking up to this sad reality and is trying to take a different approach now.
Well, you say overnight. China has noticed actually nothing would happen overnight, right? Especially with the population change. China is getting older faster. As you said, that many other countries, according to the UN, it will take China just 20 years for the proportion of the elderly population to double from 10% to 20%. The next closest is Japan. Remember, Japan was the country that many worried would have an aging population too big to absorb. In Japan, it took 23 years to have that kind of proportion. By comparison, it took 61 years in Germany and 64 years in Sweden. Wow, those numbers really illustrate, Mr. Gao, something here. But the question is, okay, we have noticed this trend. Let's change the policy. But once the policy is changed, will really people follow suit? What do you think?
Well, first of all, these demographic changes in China are profound, and it cannot be reversed or amended overnight. Mm-hmm. It takes sometimes a very long cycle to generate an impact on the demographic changes. Secondly, couples in China actually have become accustomed to a smaller size family, one child per family. And now if you ask them to have a second baby, it's not only a shift in the policy, but it would require a mentality change.
And lifestyle.
Lifestyle change, exactly. And also it's a lot of economic considerations going into that. Therefore, I think it is really time for the government to think about subsidies. For example, the government actually can subsidize the kindergartens or nurseries so that couples will find it easier to raise the second-born child.
Mr. Gao, your point on, because you know the challenges of raising a child, both financial, psychological, and also physical in China, particularly in the cities.
Definitely.
Which is getting ever bigger in the area, is the biggest thing facing the couples these days. Mr. Gao, you also know better than I do that earlier people could have more children because everything is being taken care of by the state. And everybody have the same kinds of education, same kind of medical treatment, and same kinds of working opportunities. So people don't feel this competition. But now everything's changed. So will people still be able to, as you said, encouraged by the policy to follow suit? That's a big question mark.
Definitely. I think it would take two to tango. First of all, for the
probably
families,
even more than two.
Definitely. For the couples in particular, they need to really readjust to the current situation where more babies are welcome. Secondly, I think
but
the government...
why would they?
Well,
this is voluntary, isn't it?
First of all, in Chinese mentality, the traditional preference is to have larger family for whatever reason previously valid in history. But now in urban cities, at least couples prefer actually one child for a smaller family. That means the government need to really come up with a solid package of subsidies and make adjustments not only in terms of the policy but also providing a whole range of goodies, if I may use that term, so that the couples will be incentivized to have more than one child per family.
Mr. Lin, I mean, in history, we've seen abrupt policy changes that certainly made a certain kind of impact. During the Second World War, for example, both in the United States and also in Russia, at the time, former Soviet Union, there has been policies encouraging mothers to have more children to prepare the country and to contribute to the cause. That was called hero mothers. But of course, things are very different these days. Mr. Lin, do you think people really have the incentive, despite of the traditional belief, as Mr. Gao earlier illustrated?
Thanks, Tianwei. You know, this is a very, very challenging issue. It requires a kind of all sort of dimension approach in solving the issue. Let's take, for example, Sweden and Sweden, for example. It took them 150 years to have a fertility transition, meaning to bring down the population to 2.1. But it took China, what, four decades only. So the process, China really took a shorter process. But at the same time, so now it's, you know, it's faced with this issue. It's got to solve the issue, and it's very interestingly enough. The issue now is that you know, the family planning program to have less children is really as a voluntary sort of choice by parents, by couples, and I hope that we hope at the UNA we hope that China will be able to try to benefit from like experience of Sweden and France, where they're doing quite well in terms of boosting the fertility rate. And quite a few countries, in fact, in the world today, like Japan and South Korea, for example, are faced with a similar issue. And you've probably, it's very, very interesting that Spain, just 2 days ago, announced the appointment of a minister. It's called the Minister of Sex, try to encourage, bring up the fertility rate of Spain. So this is a very, very difficult issue. The government will find it very difficult to do this program, encourage people to have more children than to have less children. Well, it's going to be very challenging.
It is very challenging, Mr. Lin, but you know, the other thing that is extremely challenging is the development stage China is in right now. I mean, you can tell through development history, a country when it's reaching certain stages, people tend to be favoring lesser members of the family, smaller family. For example, in Singapore, you also mentioned Japan a few decades ago. South Korea going through the same thing. Singapore, by the way, is totally, many of them are Chinese populations, ethnic Chinese. So you could tell, even with the tradition, people think very differently. So, Mr. Lin, I want to ask you about that development stage issue. And will, birth policies be able to be independent from the development stage a country is in? Briefly from you, sir.
No, absolutely not, because today the voluntary sort of choice by parents, by couples not to have a second child is that is due to many factors. Of course, you have women want more. They don't want opportunity loss. They want to go out to work and realize their own values. But at the same time, there's issues like cost issues and educational costs, and housing costs, everything. And this is exactly what is happening in countries like Singapore and Japan and South Korea. But the difference between China and these countries is that China is not so, in terms of per capita, GDP and the economic development, it's not as advanced as quite a few other countries as yet. So China is getting old before it becomes prosperous.
That's true. Getting older before becoming richer. Final point from you,
yes,
Mr. Gao.
Now, I think the Chinese government need to be bolder in coming up with more policy initiatives in encouraging more births in China, because by abolishing the one-child policy, allowing the second birth per couple, the policy itself is very timid. It's, I think eventually the Chinese government probably will need to lift the ban on the number of kids each family can have. It should be left to the families to decide how many kids they want to have.
As a result of that, there are other questions will pop up as well. For example, the qualities of the new birth and many others. Thank you so much. This is a mind-boggling issue, I guess, facing every country, the population issue.